welcome everybody to Drisha, to the second part of a 6-part series on the laws of Kashrut and Jewish-Gentile relations by Dr. Shana Strauch Schick. As you remember from last week, Dr. Strauch Schick is a fellow of the Center for Israel Studies at Yeshiva University and teaches Talmud and halakhah in Michelet Mevaseret Yerushalayim and Matan in Israel and in the Drisha Summer Kollel. In 2011, she became the first woman to be awarded a PhD in Talmudic literature from Bernard Revel Graduate School at Yeshiva University, where she also completed an MA in Bible. She studied in the graduate program in Advanced Talmud at Stern College and has held postdoctoral fellowships at Bar Ilan and Haifa University. Her upcoming book, Between Thought and Deed, Intention in Talmudic Jurisprudence, examines the role of intentionality in the development of Talmudic law and is being published by Brill. So without further ado, Dr. Strauch Schick.
Thank you so much, and welcome back, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And this week we're going to continue our study of the laws of Bishul Akum, food which was cooked and prepared by a non-Jew. So just to review a little bit, I'm going to share my screen. Last week we saw that the Mishnah in Avoda Zara 2:6 lists various foods which are prohibited to eat, not because they're not kosher per se, but rather because they were decreed to help prevent, it seems, either Jewish-Gentile relations or the fear that there may be something non-kosher mixed in without the knowledge of the Jew. So the one we are looking at now is food cooked by a non-Jew. And we saw that Rashi gave 2 reasons for the prohibition. Either it's a social policy. If you fear if you eat their food, you may come to eat together, then that'll ultimately lead to a larger social problem of intermarriage, or a Kashrut reason. They may add some non-kosher food and you'll be eating a treif. And we saw various practical differences that arise from these 2 reasons. So then we started to see some leniencies which were introduced with regard to this law. So we saw 2 different traditions, either that any food that can be eaten raw, the prohibition does not apply to. So if you have a vegetable which can be eaten raw, or of course water that can be eaten raw, even if a non-Jew were to heat it up, you would be allowed to eat it or drink it. Or any food that's not fit to be served at a king's table, that would also not fall under the prohibition of Bishul Akum if a non-Jew then were to cook. And we saw that's a very subjective kind of thing, which depends on the times. I read that the Star K calls the White House to see what foods they serve. Now, today we're going to see other leniencies which were applied to this prohibition. And we're going to see other times where a Bishul Akum does not apply, meaning that even if a non-Jew were to cook the food, it would be okay. So we've already seen that 1, food that can be eaten raw, the prohibition of a Bishul Akum does not apply. 2, food that would not be served on a king's table, the food also does not apply. So today we are going to see more leniencies which were applied. So the first one we're going to look at is that if it's mixed with other food and it's not the majority of the food, then it would also not fall under the prohibition of Bishul Akum. If the cooking occurs in the house of a Jew, we're going to see that was also a leniency which was applied. And hopefully we'll get to the last one, which is the most well-known. I think that if the Jew is involved in the cooking process in some way, that would also mitigate the problem of Bishul Akum. So let's get at it. Now, I have a very ambitious list of texts which I gave to you. I can't say we'll get through all of them, but we'll do our best. So perhaps I will share my screen. So for those of you who don't have it, can have access to them. It's very long. Can't say we're going to get to all of them, but we'll do what we can. Okay, so this is class 2. Now we're going to look at the leniencies of Bishul Akum. So the first one, as I just said, is where it's in a ta'arovet. Ta'arovet is it's in a mixture. There's other foods. You have one food, 2 foods which are cooked together, and only one of the foods which have a prohibition of a Bishul Akum, and the other food, and the food which a Bishul Akum would apply to is not most of the food being cooked. So the source for this is in a Talmudic a text, also in the Bavli, Avoda Zara Lamechet Amun Al. So let's read this together. Mar Rav Asi and Mar Rav. So Rav Asi said the name of Rav, and Rav again is a prominent first generation Babylonian Amora, Talmudic rabbi. He writes, who says, Dagim ketanim meluchim. If you have small salted fish, im behem mishum bibishule of day kochavim. There's no problem of a bishul akum in small salted fish, and Rashi explains because ne'achalim kimot shehem machmat milcham, because you can eat them the way they are. You don't have to cook them. They can be eaten raw because of the salt that's been added to them. And a fish, by the way, is a whole area, and does the fact that we nowadays eat fish raw in a sushi make a fish a food that would be eaten raw? So it's a debate amongst the post-game whether fish nowadays, even big fish, would be accounted as a food can be eaten raw. And there's more than what we learn here. There's so much more that can be learned. So we're just not even scratching the surface. So anyways, so the small fish, since it has salt added to it, that's a food that can be eaten raw. And therefore, if a non-Jew were to then cook it, there'd be no problem of a bishul akum. And Amar Rav Yosef, so Rav Yosef says, Im salam oved kochavim. Okay, this then goes into other laws. Can you use it for your Erev Tav Shilin? Okay, and whether or not you can do that. So, so it says that, so if a non-Jew were to roast it, so Mech Yisrael alei mishum Eruvei Tav Shilin, a Jew could use it for the Erev Tav Shilin, in between Shabbat and Chag. But if a non-Jew were to make this a dish out of this fish, where you add flour to it, that would be a treif. You would not be allowed to eat it if they made this a dish out of this salted fish. So ask the Talmud, Peshita. This is obvious. Of course, you can't have this kind of a food that they make out of the salted fish. If they were to add flour, of course you're not allowed to eat this fish. So says the Gemara, no, this is not obvious. Mahu detema, what might you have thought? Harsana ikar. Maybe you would have thought that the fish is the main ingredient of this food. And since the fish has no problem of a bishul akum, then maybe the whole dish has no problem of a bishul akum. But kamashmala, we learn from here that no, it's not the fish which is the primary ingredient. Rather, it's the kemach. It's the flour which is the primary ingredient. And since the flour has a problem of a bishul akum, so too the fish has this whole fish dish which with the flour mixed into it, maybe it's like a breaded kind of a fish. The whole food therefore has a problem of a bishul akum. So meaning the Shulchan Aruch sums up what this halakhah, what the law being put forth is. Eruv davar ne'achal k'mot shehu chai, im davar she'enu ne'achal k'mot shehu chai. If you mix together two foods, one food can be eaten raw, and you mix it together with a food that you cannot eat raw. For example, fish with flour. No one eats raw flour. Uvishlam oved kochavim. And then a non-Jew cooks it. Im ha'ikar midavar sheyesh bo mishum bishulei oved kochavim asur. Vimlav mutar. You go by whatever the main ingredient is. If the main ingredient is the food that is able to be eaten raw, then this food may be eaten. It's not a problem of a bishul akum. If, however, the main ingredient is a food which cannot be eaten raw, then this food does constitute a bishul akum, and you would not be allowed to eat it. So we go by what's called the rove. Majority takes a precedent. Majority rules. That is a law we see, a principle we see in many areas of halakhah. We always go by the rove, and here too we go by the rove as well. If you have a food which can be eaten raw mixed with a food that cannot be eaten raw, whichever food is the rove, whichever there is more of is the primary ingredient, that's what you go by. So this has very practical implications. This is why, for example, you're allowed to buy a cup of coffee at a McDonald's, because even though there's a coffee, you can't eat that raw, and that's roasted by a non-Jew. But what is there more of, coffee or water? Since there's more water, the water is the primary ingredient, and water obviously can be assumed raw, and therefore there's no problem of Bishul Akum. This also came up a lot with beer. Beer was, for much of the time, that was a primary drink people would have. Water wasn't generally clean. They couldn't drink water much of the time. So a beer was a very much consumed drink. And since the primary ingredient there is to water, that's why they're allowed to drink a beer, even if it's made by a non-Jew. And, just to hark back to halakhah we saw last time, I just want to bring this back, that, well, it's related to the next halakhah and brought by the Shulchan Aruch and Sif Gimel. So a very much assumed a dish during medieval times seemed to have been what we call a pareka, like a dough with either meat or a cheese mixed in with it. They eat that a lot, it seems. A lot of halachot deal with it. So it talks about a panda. It's called like Spanish. Apparently, it's called an empanada. So a panda she'afa oved kochavim. Asura fil l'mishnu hey ketchup b'pat shel oved kochavim. So you have this a dough with, let's say, meat inside. Now, even though a primary ingredient is the bread, and as we're going to learn, there's a great leniency when it comes to the bread baked by a non-Jew. But nevertheless, writes Rav Yosef Akairo, that even if you are makil about the bread of a non-Jew, you are still not allowed to eat it, because shehashuman ne'esar keshehu be'ein, because there's like oil of the meat, which it's very substantial. So it's there and you can see it, and the meat has a problem of mishum bishule oved kochavim v'nivla be'pat. So then that oil of the meat gets absorbed in the meat. Okay, now here Rabbi Akiva Eger has a question based on what we just learned. He writes, "Wait, nivla be'pat, the oil gets absorbed in the bread. Wait a minute, debatel berov." But there is, even if there's still oil there is still less oil than there is the bread. So shouldn't the oil be a batel, be null next to the bread? And we are lenient when it comes to the bread of a non-Jew. So he's really asking a question. He says, well, maybe because oil of meat is so substantial that, maybe that's why we are strict here. But meaning, he's saying really it should be okay because there's less oil of meat than there is the bread. So this just underscores a point that we go by rove, we go by whatever the primary ingredient is, and therefore when we are machmir, attention is called to that. So he says maybe since oil of meat is very significant, and even if it's less than, even though there's maybe less oil than there is meat, but since it's really there, it's be'ein, you can see it. Maybe that's why we are strict in this case. And another halakhah we saw last time is if a non-Jew cooks, even a kosher food in a pot, and that makes it a bishul akum. Remember, we saw that there's a machloket. There are two opinions as to whether your pot then requires kashering, and does a bishul akum affect the pot or not? And we saw that some say the pot's fine. That was the opinion of the Rashi. You would not have to kasher the pot. And some say, the Rashba says, no, you do have to kasher the pot, because once we say a bishul akum is not okay, it becomes as if it's a treif, a food which would affect the pot. But either way, says the Shach here, but even according to the opinion that says you do have to kosher the pot, notes the Shach, a commentator on the Shulchan Aruch, he says, nevertheless, im nivatzla, im nitbashla bahem b'diava, but if you do and go use a pot that a non-Jew cooked in, meaning if you do, even according to the opinion that says that a Bishul Akum affects the pot and you would have to kosher the pot, if you did go in a cook in the pot without koshering it, if there's more of the food you're cooking now, then the taste of the Bishul Akum that was absorbed into the walls of the pot, your food is fine, because again, rov, there's more food that you're making now than there is a taste of the food that's been absorbed into the walls of the pot. And based on this principle of batel berov, we could be lenient, and your food is a kosher. So even those who say you do have to kosher the pot after a Bishul Akum is made in this pot, if you did go and cook in the pot without koshering it, it's okay. You may eat this food because there's more of this food than the Husser food that was in the walls of the pot. So this is a first leniency we're learning about today, that if there's more non-Bishul Akum food than a Bishul Akum food, then that's okay. So that's why, again, you can have a coffee made by a non-Jew, because there's the coffee beans that has a Bishul Akum, but there's less of that than the water. And water is no problem with a Bishul Akum, so therefore you're allowed to have a coffee in any restaurant. Okay, so that's our first leniency. If there's a ta'arovet, if it's a mixture and there's more non-Bishul Akum food than a Bishul Akum food, you're good to go. Okay, that's our first one. The next one is a little more controversial because there are multiple opinions about it, but this is that there's an opinion which says that there's no Bishul Akum in food that was cooked in your home, in the house of a Jew. As I wrote here, Beveto shel Yisrael. Now, this is a leniency that we don't find in the Talmud. It's introduced during the medieval times, typically in medieval Ashkenaz. And I'll talk about that soon, why that would be. So this is introduced in Tosafot. And Tosafot, as I think I mentioned last time, they were a group of rabbis who lived basically during the Crusades, during the 12th and 13th centuries. Many of them are the grandsons of Rashi. Not all of them, but many of them are. So,
Dr. Strauch, Schick, we have a question in the chat.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Daphna asked if this is a similar idea to Batel Bishishim.
That is an excellent point, and that is another principle. So it's not exactly the same, and it's a question of like, well, why do we even need a Batel Bishishim? That's such a great question, and it's kind of a big one. You know, it's a Lam Adisha question. There's a lot of Torah on that question. But Batel Bishishim is another Hilchot Kashrut principle, that if you have 60 times a treif food, I mean, mamish treif. So this isn't a treif food. This is food which is a kosher inherently, but Hazal made a decree on it. Batel Bishishim says even if you mix a treif, like a drop of milk falls into meat. So that's basar ve'chalav. That's meat and milk. I mean, that's a treif min hator, or a piece of lard falls into your food. Batel Bishishim is saying, that's okay. That does not make it a treif. But rov would not work with, even if I have more, meat than milk, it's still basar ve'chalav. Even if I have more kosher food than the pork that fell in my food, no, that's, rov is not going to help that. But there's certainly a lot of Torah on that question, and what is a Batel Bishishim? So it's an excellent question. Hilchot Kashrut that's part of what makes it such a hard area of halakhah, because it's very circular. There's no beginning and end, and things kind of relate to each other, and that makes it hard. There's no, you can, everything relates, and so you have to know things that you still have to begin somewhere, so that you're going to pass concepts that you haven't learned yet, but they all relate. So that's excellent question. That relates to like a treif, and this is an issue of food which is inherently kosher, but it has a zara against eating it. Okay, so in the house of it, and then that was a great place to ask a question. If there's not more questions, we will continue with our next leniency when it comes to Bishul Akum. So Tosfos writes, so this again, not in the Talmud, this appears only in Tosfos and in the Rishonim. Amar of Avram Berevi David, the Ravid. So the Ravid writes, Devadai shlakot asru chachamim keshoved kochavim mivashlam beveito. When Chazal prohibited the food cooked by a non-Jew, that's only where the food is cooked in the house of a non-Jew. But if the non-Jew were to cook the food in the house of a Jew, in lachush, there is no concern. Lo lechatnot, there's no concern of intermarriage. And there's also no concern lest they come to add non-kosher food, which that I get. It's in your own house. So, there's no concern that they'll bring in non-kosher in ingredients, or that they'll mix meat and milk together. Other Shonim talk about this because you're there, you're walking around. Now, maybe you're not there in the kitchen at the same time that they're cooking, but you may come in and out, and the fear that you might enter is enough to, make someone not mix non-kosher foods together. Before I get back to this, I just want to read then the next part of Tosfos, which says, so that's one view. The Ravid says, a Bishul Akum only applies when the food was cooked in a non-Jew's home, but it never applied in the house of a Jew. But lo hoda lo Rabbeinu Tam. But Rabbeinu Tam, the Tosafist, Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Meir, who's a grandson of Rashi, he disagrees. He says, no, devadai, kevan shavei kochavim mevashel, if the non-Jew cooks the food, lo chelko klal chachamim be'rishus Yisrael, l'rishus obed kachamim. It doesn't matter where the food was cooked. Kili olam yesh lochosh shema lo yizaher gam beito shel Yisrael kamo beito shel obed kochavim. The same concerns apply irrespective of where the food was made. Whether it's made of a home of a Jew or the home of a non-Jew, a Bishul Akum applies. And Rabbeinu Tam is kind of right. The Chazal never made such a distinction. So, there's no reason, says Rabbeinu Tam, to say that this wouldn't apply if it were made in the house of a Jew versus the house of a non-Jew. Now, a little historical background here is in order, and as I promised, I did say we would talk about the cultural context and all these halakhah, and especially here, that the reality of medieval Europe, especially medieval Ashkenaz, which is Germany, is that slavery was a very prevalent reality of the world at that time. There were a lot of wars between Ottoman and Byzantine with the Slavs, and there were a lot of, pagan slaves are brought in, and the economy really relied on slavery. And medieval people, Christian and Jews alike, did not see any theological problem with owning another person. And it was just a reality. The church owned slaves, everyone owned slaves, even poor people owned slaves, and Jews were no different than anyone else. And there is really an abundance of halachic literature from the medieval times about all the halachic ramifications about the fact that Jews had non-Jewish slaves or servants in their homes doing much of the household labor, whether cooking and Shabbos issues, who they would get rid of their hametz to. Even there's a concern of doing a bidikat hametz. Would the non-Jew think they're engaged in some sort of magical practice, which would then cause problems? There's concerns of theft. So there's a lot of talk about the fact that Jews owned slaves, both from a Jewish halachic literature as well as non-Jewish literature as well. There's a Christian decrees and charters which talk about the problem of Jews owning specifically Christian slaves and Christian servants, and the church, or many in the church, didn't like the idea that a Jew would own a Christian, and that a Jew who should be on the lower realm of society would be on the upper rung over a Christian. And many slaves, even though they were originally pagans, would often convert to Christianity because they thought they can maybe become freed. And actually a charter was made that said, no, if someone baptizes, they can still remain in the domain of a Jew. And the halachic literature also talks about if a Jew forcibly converts their slaves, they're allowed to touch your wine, and just all these halachot. Chaim Soloveitchik wrote, a book about wine production during Middle Ages, and the fact that just so many people owned slaves, and there was so much work to be done making wine. All these halachot of allowing non-Jewish slaves to make your wine, do all the various processes to make wine. So slaves, non-Jewish servants, were a regular reality, specifically in medieval Ashkenaz. So there was just a very good chance that the person preparing your food was not going to be a Jew. And so therefore, we can understand on one hand why perhaps a leniency would be made for, maybe if it's in your home, that would be okay. But on the other hand, Rabbeinu Tam, in this case, is being true to the Talmudic text, which is, well, that doesn't matter. This is never mentioned in the Talmud. There's no heter given for if it's made by a Jew or not. And this machlok between the Ravid and Rabbeinu Tam continues throughout the later sources as well. So in the Torah, the Arba Turim, he writes both sides. It says, "V'harev Avraham haya matiram im b'shlam obed kochavim beveito shel Yisrael." The Ravid, he allowed food cooked by a non-Jew in the house of a Jew because lo shavu lo mishum chatnut lo mishum shama yachlenu dibarim tmeim, because he thought both concerns do not apply. There's no fear of intermarriage, and there's no fear that they may feed you on a kosher food. But Rabbeinu Tam cholek alav, but Rabbeinu Tam disagreed with that. V'chei nohagim, and that is our custom. Now, I should say that there is a text by the Or Zarua who actually sees the machloket, the debate between the Ravid and Rabbeinu Tam, as based on why a Bishul Akum is a problem in the first place. Meaning, we read in the Tosfos that the Ravid holds that both reasons brought by Rashi don't apply in the home of a Jew, but one way to read it as maybe this is that this is the debate between the Ravid and Rabbeinu Tam, meaning what's the reason for a Bishul Akum? If the reason is lest they come to mix non-kosher food, then yeah, that's not a concern in the house of a Jew. But if the reason is it might lead to intermarriage, that could still apply even in the house of a Jew. And maybe Rabbeinu Tam thinks that's the reason, as the Ravid thinks, no, it's lest they come to feed you non-kosher food as the other reason. So there is one opinion which sees that as the source of their dispute. Clearly, that's not the view of the Tosfot as we have it. So the Torah goes with Rabbeinu Tam. We do not rely on this leniency. The Adarche Moshe, which is authored by Rev Moshe Isserlis, who's the author of the Ramah, the Ashkenazi notes on the Shulchan Aruch, he writes here that he cites the Hagot Sharei Adura B'Shem Mahari, Bekama Mikomot Nohagim Lahatir, Lehaniach Shefachot Goyot Lebashel Ulitzlo Babayit. Says even though the Torah says that the practice is like Rabbeinu Tam to not allow for this leniency, Others say, well, actually, there are people who do rely on this, and they do let you eat the food made by your non-Jewish maid, if it was cooked in your home. Even though the Jew had absolutely no part in, making the food whatsoever. So that the non-Jewish maid cooks all of the food. Ve'efshar shesamchu aha di'i efshar shelo yechate acha mipnei habayit begechalim. Now, how can we rely on this if Rabbeinu Tam was so against it? So it says, well, maybe we can rely on the fact that, if it's in the house of a Jew, had been a Jew who came and stoked the coals. A Jew had we can assume that a Jew had some apart, and maybe that's why we can rely on that. V'shamina mikan de chitoy mahani. And what we can learn from here is that since we can say maybe a Jew stoked the coal, or in our day that would be adjust the heat, adjust the dials, maybe that's adequate. And we're going to get to that in the next leniency that we talk about. But anyway, the Ramah says, people nevertheless rely on this. And they have their non-Jewish maids make their food, even though the Jew didn't actually have any part in it. Because maybe we can just assume that a Jew was bound to have done some aspect of it, even if it was just adjusting the dial. And these two views are brought down in the Shulchan Aruch as well, and in the Ramah. So the Shulchan Aruch writes, the next source you have, Davar she'eino ne'achal kemot shu chai, any food that can't be eaten raw, v'gam olal shulchan melachim, and it is served on a king's table, a lepapo et pot, to accompany bread, olapar aperet, sheveshlu oved kochavim, that a non-Jew cooked, afilu b'kli Yisrael b'beit Yisrael, even if it's in made in the pots of a Jew, and in the house of a Jew, says Rav Yosef Akairo, Passer, this is prohibited. Nothing helps if a non-Jew cooked the food, as long as it can't be eaten raw, and it can't go on a king's table. And of course, there's more of that than other food, but it's usser. And the fact that it was made in the Jew's home will not help. But then he goes on in Sivdal and writes that Yesh Misha Matir Bishvachot Shalanu. But there is an opinion which allows our servants. V'yesh Misha Oser. But there's also one who says, no, it does not help. Afilo b'di'avad. So he brings both views. Some allow the non-Jewish maid or slave to make the food. Others say, no, it's never allowed. Even if they cook it, you're not allowed to eat it. And the Ravid here writes, Ubidiavad, yesh l'smoch ad divrei matirim. And we can rely on the lenient view. Afilu, okay, Hidiavad, if the food was already cooked by a non-Jew, says the Ramah, you can eat it, Hidiavad, after the fact. And then the Ramah goes on, Afilu l'chatchila, Nuhagim lehakel b'beit Yisrael. And the Ramah writes, and not only can you be lenient b'diavad after the fact if a regular non-Jew cooked the food, but you can even be lenient before the fact. You can lechatchila, allow in your own home the servant to cook your food. Shehashvachot v'avadim mevashlim b'beit Yisrael. If a servant is the one making the food in your own home, says Ramah, lechatchila, you can eat the food. Because it's impossible that someone didn't come and stir the fire, or in our day adjust the knobs. So let me just illustrate, make it more clear what these two opinions are in a chart. So if a non-Jew cooks in the house of a Jew, we see, and this is any non-Jew, it's not talking about a slave per se. The Ravid was allowed this, and maybe because there's no fear of eating non-kosher food, Whereas Rabbeinu Tam says it would still be prohibited because maybe his reasons are still a fear of intermarriage. Now, moving into how the halakhah is decided, the Shulchan Aruch went with Rabbeinu Tam. The non-Jew cooks the food, even in your own home, the food would still not be allowed. Whereas the Ramah says, if after the fact the non-Jew already made the food, you shouldn't lechatchila tell a non-Jew to cook your food for you. But if they already did, you can eat it. Now, what about if it's a servant who makes the food? So the Shulchan Aruch says, some are machmir, some say it's not okay, some are lenient. The Ramah says, however, when it comes to a servant, you can be lenient lechatchila when it's a servant who cooks in the house of a Jew. He allows this leniency, even lechatchila, going with the leniency of the Ravid. Now, even within the leniency that the Shulchan Aruch talks about, there are some who limit it to a specific kind of servant, that it's not all. It's only perhaps a slave who's not a cooking of their own volition, but who has absolutely no choice in the matter. A slave is entirely, within the will of the master, and a slave is basically a property of the owner. So the slave, basically is doing a total will of the owner and does not have their own will to speak of. And this, the Shach brings down this opinion of the Ravid. So let me just go back and bring the screen share. So the Shach here writes, he brings down the opinion this Aleph Vav stands for Sefer Isser V'Heter Shamal Harshal, that he may be Teshuvat HaRamban. He brings the opinion of Ramban, who is Nachmanides, who writes, Diyesh me rabotenu matirim b'shvachot mitam de'en isur mishum b'shulei obed kochavim ela be'osem mirtzono. That maybe a Bishul Akum only applies if the non-Jews are cooking of their own will. So therefore, if it's a slave who has no will of their own, because everything they do is based on the will of their owner, maybe a Bishul Akum only in that case wouldn't apply. But if they're doing it from their own will, then there's a problem. Mishum gezerot chatnut. About ilu hashvachot v'havadim shalanu. So our servants and our slaves she'osim ba'al karcham. They do whatever they do against their will. Bein yirtzu, bein lo yirtzu, because they are owned by their owner, because they have no will of their own. Maybe it's only that case that the Shulchan Aruch's, yesh matirim would have been lenient about. Only in this case, aim bazeh kiruv hadat, only when it's a slave who has no will and is only a cooking entirely based on the, will of their own, or maybe only in that case is there no fear that it will lead to any kind of relationship, and only that would the Shulchan Aruch be lenient about. But then, so that's the view of Nachmanides. But then the Maharshal writes, the Ramban still writes, Mikomakon ein divrehem mechuvarim. But nevertheless, this is not a clear, says the Ramban. Ve'ein somchin al zeh. But we should not rely even on that. I don't know, Hagim Isur afilu b'diavad, right? The Nachmanides, that even a slave you should still not allow. Even that's a problem of Bishul Akum. So now the Shach explains, yesh lomar desfarat hamatir shekatav mechaver hu mitam zeh. So some say that when the Shulchan Aruch was lenient, when he brought this, yesh mi shematir, maybe he was only referring to a slave, and he'd only be lenient in that regard. And maybe, and then maybe when the Ramah also said that we can rely on it, maybe he too is only referring to a slave. But then the Shach says, but but they never actually say that. But ultimately says the Shach, since they never actually say that, you don't have to limit the leniency to a slave. That's what the Shach ultimately says. So while some may say that maybe the leniency of a servant, a cook in the home of a Jew, would only apply to a slave who has no will of their own, since neither of Yosef Karo in the Shulchan Aruch the Beit Yosef nor Rav Moshe Isserles in the Darchei Moshe or the Ramah made that explicit, there's no reason to limit it to a slave, and both of their leniencies would apply even to a non-slave servant. So whether that is relied on lechatchila, it seems there's certainly two views on the matter, but it's something which is taken into account at least some times. Is there any questions or are there any questions on this?
Yeah, I have a question. So does this apply in restaurants if the idea is just that, let's say it's a Jewish-owned restaurant, but it's not necessarily kosher, and you'll have a Jew around there, so maybe they'll mix the pot? If that's the idea behind it?
What goes on in a restaurant, that's not, they usually rely on the Jew turning on the oven as well. Now, and whether it's relying on lechatchila or only in a home, that's a different question. But it seems that most restaurants would rely on the next leniency we're going to look at. And again, this is not something that seems that most would rely on lechatchila. And now, so just to review what we said. So if a non-Jew cooks in the house of a Jew, there was one opinion which allows us by the Ravid, Rabbeinu Tam still wasn't very, did not feel this was a helpful akula. The Shulchan went with Rabbeinu Tam. The Ramah was more inclined to be lenient about this, certainly b'di avad. Throughout a person's house and realize, that their non-Jewish worker made the food, you can eat it. Don't worry. You don't have to ask them, well, did you turn on the oven? It's not a problem. You can rely on that food and eat it according to the Ramah. And he says there are some who are even making lechatchila that you are allowed to have, a non-Jewish worker cook the food in your house. Now there is an opinion and the Shulchan Aruch brought down that some are lenient if it is a servant. Now the Ramban would understand this to be limited to a slave, since a slave has no say in the matter and they can have to do whatever the owner orders them to do. But ultimately says the Shach, since neither the Shulchan Aruch or the Ramah brought that qualification, there's no reason to limit it to that. Okay, now the Ramah mentioned what's the root for allowing this leniency of a non-Jewish person cooking in your home. He wrote because it's possible that someone didn't come and adjust the fire. This now leads to the last leniency we're going to look at, and a very important one, which, as someone just asked, is something which is relied on very much, that the Jew has to be involved in the cooking in some way. So we'll now go on to the next set of texts. So let's look onto the last group of texts, and here's where things get long. So sorry, number 3. If a Jew participates in the cooking process. Now this has its basis in the Talmud. So it's going to be a long one. So hopefully we'll get to this whole thing today. So it says in our same sugya in Avoda Zara la Mechet, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Hiniach Yisrael basar al gabe gechalim. A Jewish man leaves the meat on the fire. He's making a barbecue. Puts meat on the grill. V'uva oved kochavim v'hafach bo. And then a non-Jew comes and turns over the meat. Is that okay? Mutar, this food is allowed to be eaten. So ask the Gemara, well, what's the case here? Heichi adami. If you would say that this food would have cooked even had the non-Jew not turned the food over, then obviously this food is okay. Like it was really cooked by the Jew, and that a non-Jew didn't add in any meaningful way by turning the meat over. Please. So rather, if it's a case where had the non-Jew not turned the meat over, then the meat would not have cooked. But then but then why should this food be allowed? It was really cooked by the non-Jew. If this meat would have never been completed cooking unless the non-Jew turned it over, then it's really the non-Jew who cooked the food, and it should not be allowed. This should be a Bishul Akum. So answers like Gemara, lo tzricha. No, so we do need this case. So what's the case? It's a case where had the non-Jew not turned the meat over, it would have taken 2 hours to cook. And now, since the non-Jew turned the meat over, it's only going to take 1 hour to cook. So, what might you have thought? Kiruve bishula miltahi. Maybe you would have thought that the fact that the non-Jews sped up the cooking, maybe that is legally significant. Maybe the fact that had the non-Jew not cooked, turned it over, it would have taken 2 hours. Now that he turned it over, it's going to take 1 hour. Maybe that is as if he actually cooked the food now. And maybe that should make it a Bishul Akum. So Kamash Malan, we learn from here that hastening the cooking does not constitute a new act, or is not legally significant to make this be a new act of a Bishul Akum. Okay. Now the Gemara goes on. But wait a minute. So you just said if a non-Jew intercedes in the cooking, there's no problem of a Bishul Akum. But we have another halakhah brought in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, which says, Kol shu kemachal ben derusai, ein bo mishum bishulei ovdei kachdim. Any food that reaches the minimal amount of cooking, as long as it reaches that a point, then if a non-Jew then comes and, intercedes in the cooking, there's no problem of a Bishul Akum. Now, some people may recall this term, machal ben derusai, food that's cooked to the amount that a certain group of Yiddish would eat it. We find that term also in regard to halakhah Shabbat as well. That's the minimal amount that a food has to be cooked in order to, you're allowed to leave it on the fire on Shabbos and not violate further cooking. So there's a lot of overlap between halakhah Shabbat and the laws of cooking and the cooking in regard to a Bishul Akum. So as long as the food has been minimally cooked, if a non-Jew then comes and gets involved with the cooking, there's no more problem of a Bishul Akum. But what does that then imply? Ha'enu kemachal ben derusai. That implies that had the food not been cooked to machal ben derusai, yesh bo mishum bishulei ovdei kochavim. Then there will be a problem of a Bishul Akum, even if it would have cooked in 2 hours. Now it's only going to cook in 1 hour. I mean, we just said in the previous halakhah that if a non-Jew merely speeds up the cooking, there's no problem of Bishul Akum. But here we see that's not the case, that the food has to be minimally cooked to Machal ben Derusai in order for there to be no problem of Bishul Akum. But meaning if it's not yet cooked to Machal ben Derusai, then there would be a problem of Bishul Akum, even if they just hastened the cooking process. So that seems to contradict. So a solution is given that Hatim going to Otzve Hilta, that it's a case that the previous case is where you put it in a basket. You put it on an oven and it would have cooked without the non-Jew flipping it, but it would have just taken longer. That's Shamuel's case. It was placed on an oven. In this case, the Rebbe Yochanan is where you put it in otzve besilta, when you put it in a basket. So it wouldn't have cooked at all. Okay, so we are able to resolve it. That's the point here. So a non-Jew being involved still does not automatically make it a problem of Bishul Akum. Okay, now we'll skip down a little bit. Atanya nami hachi. The next wide line, it's also taught in a Breita. If a Jew leaves meat on the fire, and a non-Jew comes along and flips the meat over, while the Jew is either at the shul or at the study hall, don't worry about it. It's fine. So a Jew left it on the fire. He then left the house to go to shul or to learn a little bit. And while he's out of the house, a non-Jew come and flips the meat over, that's fine. So Fet says isha kederal beikira, or if a Jewish woman leaves her pot on the stove, and then a non-Jewish woman comes along and stirs the food, while the Jewish woman is either at the bathhouse or the shul. And likewise, we don't have to fear. I just had to say, I love this case, because where's a paradigm of a case where a woman would go to leave her house? Shul or a bathhouse. So we see from here, women clearly went to a shul. It's not even like a question here. It's just kind of a background of where she would go. And also shul and a bathhouse, those are kind of, what do those have to do with anything? So this a passage came to me 2 years ago when I visited Hamat Tiberias in Israel, Tiberias, the agricultural area, the archaeological park there, the ancient shul of Tiberias, where the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Breita lived, was right next to the hot springs and the bathhouse that was built on it. So at least in Tiberias, where many of the rabbis who were the authors of this Breita would have lived, the shul was right next to the bathhouse. So I always wonder, maybe this Breita was from Tiberias. It's possible. So anyways, if a Jewish man or woman leaves their food on the fire, then they leave their house, not for a very, very long time, but certainly more than 2 minutes. And a non-Jew can come along and either flip it over or stir the food, and we're not concerned. Okay, now it asks another case. Ivailahu. So we see that if the Jew leaves the food on and a non-Jew turns it over, that's fine. But what about the opposite? What if hiniachovei kochavim v'afachi Yisrael? What if it's a non-Jew who put the food on the fire and a Jew who turned it over? Would that be okay? So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, Kal v'chomer. We can deduce, something more lenient from something more strict. If it was okay when the non-Jew was the one who flipped it over and thereby pleated it, all the more so if the Jew is the one who turned the food over, of course it should be fine. Okay, so it's fine whether it's the Jew who put the food on and the non-Jew turned it over, or it's the non-Jew who put the food on and the Jew who turns it over. That's fine as well. And now it brings one final a case here of a Jew being involved in the process of making the food. Here, however, it's not food per se, but it seems to be more of well, we'll keep going. And it says the same thing here. It brought a brighta which supports this. Now, and it says the same thing. Now let's just go out to the top of the next page. Amar Ravina. Hilchata, the halakhah is ha rifta de shagar. If you have an oven, that's what Rashi says. Rifta de shagar is hesik betanor, an oven that the fuel was put in, oved kochavim. So a non-Jew put the fuel in the oven, put the logs and the fire. But afa Yisrael, then a Jew bakes it. Now the fact that it's baked implies that we're talking about a bread here. So a non-Jew put the fuel in, and then a Jew baked in it. Inami, alternatively, shagar Yisrael ba'afa oved kochavim, or it's the Jew who fueled the oven, and a non-Jew baked the bread. Inami shagar oved kochavim, or the non-Jew put the fuel in, and the Jew and the non-Jew put the bread in, the ata Yisrael. And then what did the Jew come? Chata bachituye. And then the Jew just stoked the coals, shafir dami. That is fine. So the question, so we see here clearly when we're talking about a Bishul Akum, if a Jew participates in the cooking, whether it's they put the food on the fire and the non-Jew turns it over, or the non-Jew puts the food on the fire and the Jew turns it over, that makes it not a problem of a Bishul Akum. The question is, what about this last case of stoking the coals or adjusting the flame? Now, this case here is referring to baking. Baking generally refers to a bread. And the question we're going to see debated amongst the medieval rabbis is this a leniency of adjusting the flame, one that only applies to bread, to pat hakum, the bread of a non-Jew, or does it also apply to a bishul akum? So we'll have to leave that as a cliffhanger for next week. So just to sum up what we've done today. Now, can I share my screen now? Okay, I seem to not be able to share my screen. So today we saw, to review, that any food that can be eaten raw or any food that can be not served on a king's table, those have no problem of a bishul akum. We also saw that if food, which would be a problem of a bishul akum, is mixed with other food, which would not have a problem of a bishul akum, as long as the bishul akum food is not the rove, it's not the primary ingredient, that would also not be a problem of a bishul akum. We saw a way that if the food is cooked in the house of a Jew, that possibly there'd be no problem of a bishul akum. Now, whether one can rely on that lechatchila for the fact or b'diavad, that's a debate, but at least it is something there, at least b'diavad. And we also saw, at least preliminary, that if a Jew, definitely a Jew is involved in the cooking of the food, there's also no problem of a bishul akum. So next time we'll see, how much does the Jew have to do? How much in involvement does the Jew have to have in order to mitigate the bishul akum a problem, to then make it be not a bishul akum but a bishul Yisrael? And we'll see that is a debate amongst, once again, between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. As we saw, Ashkenazim were more had the people who were lenient with regard to cooking in a Jew's home were from Ashkenaz. We'll see a same divide amongst how minimally does a Jew have to be involved as well, with, once again, the rabbis of Ashkenaz being much, much more lenient than those of Sepharad. So we will see that next time. So thank you all very much. Apologize for the 2-minute break, but I guess I made up for it by going 5 minutes over. And I look forward to learning with everybody next week. We'll continue this and start a Pat Akum as well.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Strauch for this class. Looking forward to next week to continue. Thank you to everyone that joined today on Zoom, on Drisha Live, and on Facebook. Drisha's fall programming continues tonight at 8 p.m. with the second part of a class series by Rabbanit Leah Sarna on Kvod Hamet and Kvod Habriot, the honor of the dead. In addition to these, there are many more classes happening now. So you can find out more information and find the registration links on our website at www.drisha.org/classes. So again, thank you everyone for coming today, and we will see you soon.